Pride movement. Origins, Stonewall riots, and contemporary demonstrations/challenges, presented by Brooklyn McWilliam-Fraser. Pride background info. Pride is an annual celebration typically celebrated in June, but is celebrated at other times in other countries to celebrate the LGBTQ identity and how far they've come in receiving rights, recognition, normalcy, and fair treatment. Pride is the promotion of the self-affirmation, dignity, equality, and increased visibility of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, plus people as a social group. Gay Pride commemorates the Stonewall riots, which took place in the early morning of June 28, 1969, after police raided the Stonewall Inn bar, a gay club in New York City. Authority penalized and shut down establishments that served alcohol to anyone who was suspected to be LGBTQ people, believing the individuals assembling was disorderly. The Pride movement is a movement still celebrated and working for the rights and fair treatment of LGBTQ people today. What was it like before the 1960s for LGBTQ? In the 1960s and previous times, the LGBTQ community was not accepted or encouraged in America and other countries in the world. The 1960s specifically was one of the most legally oppressive eras for America. This is why LGBTQ individuals gathered in gay bars and clubs where refuge was possible for them and they could express themselves freely and socialize without discrimination or concern for their well-being. Some examples were like gay marriage, gay relations, and public display of homosexual affection was illegal. Committing any of these resulted in immediate arrest and potentially jail time, not to mention the physical and emotional abuse LGBTQ people endured from police officers. Many states like New York had liquor laws that made it illegal to serve alcohol to anyone suspected of being LGBTQ. It was commonplace to be scrutinized by police during this time, and if an individual was transgender or gay, they were more likely to be denied medical treatment. Stonewall and the riots. Although serving alcohol to LGBTQ individuals was illegal at the time, the Stonewall Inn was registered as a private bottle bar, which meant they didn't technically serve anyone alcohol as customers would have to bring their own. The owners of Stonewall Inn, the Genovese crime family, would also bribe the police precinct to ignore the activities occurring within their clubs in Greenwich. The Stonewall Inn quickly became popular, drag queens were welcomed, it was a nightly home for runaways and homeless gay youth for the price of $3 a night, and was one of the few gay bars left that allowed dancing. On the morning of June 28, 1969, New York City police raided the Stonewall Inn. They stormed in the club, were violent with patrons, and arrested over 13 people, including employees and anyone violating the state's gender-appropriate clothing law. Female officers would take suspected cross-dressing persons into the bathroom to check their sex. Within a few minutes of the raid, a full-blown riot burst involving hundreds of people, bar patrons, customers, neighborhood residents, and many others. Coins, stilettos, bottles, and bricks were thrown. The riot was eventually dispersed with the riot squad and the fire department, but the protest didn't stop there. For the next 5 days, humongous protests involving thousands of people continued in the area. The Stonewall riots served as a catalyst for the gay rights pride movement in the United States and around the world. Goal of the citizens. Although the Stonewall riots weren't one of the first instances where LGBTQ people fought back against the oppressive forces, the Stonewall riots was one of the first events that really kicked off the gay rights movement, Pride. The Stonewall riots were spontaneous, but the rioting through the streets led to the unity of the LGBTQ. LGBTQ demanded to be seen, heard, and respected the same way every cisgender heterosexual person was. They didn't ask for much, just to be equal and have the same freedoms. In order to establish equality, many steps had to be taken, including marriage/relationship rights, acceptance from the church, more inclusivity in workforces, removing the laws that inhibit LGBTQ's ability to express themselves freely or simply to exist, and creating a law/right to protect LGBTQ from discrimination/prejudice, and many more. Many of these steps would take decades to become a reality, unfortunately. For example, same-sex marriage wasn't legalized by all 50 states until 2015. That's only 5 years ago today. Hence why the Pride movement is still prevalent today to continue the journey to equality and freedom for all. Who was involved? The riots initially began with the homeless gay youth who were angry with the police for taking away their refuge. The Stonewall Inn was their home and it was being raided as though it were a house full of criminals. People were fed up with the police's discrimination, gay patrons resisted arrest, and as neighboring residents gathered, so did the tension until everyone was rioting against the police. The over 2,000 protesters initially rioting at Stonewall have been deemed the Stonewallers. Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera were two transgender women of color who resisted arrest, and word has it they threw the first brick that began the revolution. Marsha P. Johnson was at the forefront of the revolution leading the Stonewallers. She was a fierce and strong woman who was vocal about the injustices the gay community faced. When asked about what the P in her name stood for and when people proud of her gender or sexual orientation, she'd say, "Pay no mind." Virginia Apuzzo, Martin Boyce, Raymond Castro, Danny Garvin, and many more individuals attended the riots and grew up to become gay rights advocates and successful people. What methods did they use to achieve their goals? Rioting, destruction of property through arson, Molotov cocktails were thrown, smashing windows/storefronts in police cars, damaging monuments, resisting arrest, violent confrontations with the police. Street marches, over 2,000 people marched and gathered in the streets of Greenwich with powerful signs and shouting phrases of liberty, say it loud, gay and proud. Sit-ins and nonviolent protest, gay activists gathered outside the newspaper offices protesting the headlines of the Stonewall Uprising, which read, "The Forces of Faggotry." Once police arrived at the protest, people began rioting again, but it ended shortly around midnight. LGBTQ individuals sat in bars where it was illegal for them to be served alcohol, refusing to move until they were served or detained by police. Non-profit organizations. Sylvia and Marcia founded the STAR, Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, which offered support and shelter to homeless, transgender, and LGBTQ people in Chicago, New York, California, and England. Other organizations uplifting LGBTQ were the GAA and GLF. How did the government respond to their actions? The government wasn't a big fan of the Stonewall Uprising as it encouraged the visibility and acceptance of LGBTQ people when at the time the government was trying to exclude them from society. After the Stonewall Uprising began, hundreds of police officers were sent out to control the crowds through tear gas, barricades, intimidation, and even going as far as brutally beating up some of the protesters. The police arrested at least 21 protesters on the first night of the Stonewall riots and many more the following days. Firefighters were also there to control fires, and the newspaper headlines weren't very helpful in communicating the significance of the protest with headlines like, "Homo nest raided, Queen Bees are stringing mad," and "Nation's homosexuals show new militants in revolt against alleged persecution." The newspaper companies were biased, and the government didn't want positive coverage of the events. In fact, at this time, any journalists that produced LGBTQ content that was positive were often shut down or arrested. Why did the government respond in this matter? What motivated their response? In this era, being part of the LGBTQ community was not welcomed kindly. For example, being gay was considered a mental illness and needed therapy. It was illegal to serve gay people alcohol. It was illegal to wear more than 3 gender-inappropriate articles of clothing. And the government had laws in society against the LGBTQ community because they didn't understand or respect that being gay or trans was natural inhumanity. They most definitely weren't prepared for a gay pride revolution, so they responded with violence and humiliation. Religion had a large part to play with it as well, as many Christians, Catholics, and other religions disapproved of LGBTQ acts around this time. Previous to Stonewall, the U.S. and other nations had societal structures that benefited cisgender, heteronormative, white people and excluded people of the LGBTQ community. These establishments and institutional rights were only extended to this group of people. The government wasn't ready to revolutionize anything for the sake of the LGBTQ. What were the results, both short-term and long-term? The effects it has on society today. Short-term. 1 month after the Stonewall protest, activists organized a gay power march through Greenwich Village that accumulated hundreds of people. Organizations like the Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activist Alliance evolved out of the protests. These organizations raised money to help homeless gay youth and provide bail money to LGBTQ people who were wrongfully arrested. They also funded their own building projects like an underground gay bar so the mafia couldn't have control over how they were treated and served at bars. On the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, the first Pride March was held from Stonewall Inn all the way to Central Park with over 2,000 participants from all over. In 1970, the film The Boys Who Broke the Band was the first to feature gay main characters and themes. In 1971, a gay couple applies for a marriage license for the first time and gets married by outwitting the clerk. They are there on the right. In 1973, Mark Randall, a transgender man, wins custody of his 4 daughters. There are plenty of domino events that occurred after Stonewall, including LGBTQ people holding places in high positions, films, more social acceptance, more protests, etc. Long-term/modern demonstrations. Every June is deemed Pride Month as a commemoration to Stonewall and the liberation of LGBTQ people. Around this time, art, speeches, protests, marches, festivals, stories, etc. in light of the success are released in light of the success of LGBTQ being further accepted in society. LGBTQ art, literature, television, film celebrations is accepted in many places. 2001 was the first country to legalize same-sex marriage. Since then, over 29 countries now have legalized same-sex marriage. In 2011, President Barack Obama repealed the law Don't Ask, Don't Tell that required LGBTQ people to stay in the closet if they wanted to serve the military. 2020 SCOTUS law goes into effect, which makes it illegal to fire any LGBTQ person just for openly being LGBTQ. There's still plenty more work to do as LGBTQ people are still suffering in countries where gay and trans rights are not protected or respected, not to mention the people of color LGBTQ suffer more than their white counterparts. There's still equality to achieve. Links to liberalism. Individual rights and freedoms as self-interest. The entire Pride movement and its origins are all connected to their self-interest to achieve protection and visibility of the LGBTQ's individual rights and freedoms that weren't always protected by the government. Many rights have been achieved over time thanks to people coming together as a collective to fight for the rights and equality of all people. Modern liberalism. The modern liberal ideology promotes self-interest, justice, and equality for all people, political reform, social reform, and believes that it's the government's responsibility to uplift and protect the population. Anytime throughout gay rights activism, most of what you're hearing is pleas for the government to step up to the plate and to be accountable for the oppression of LGBTQ people. The government is supposed to act on behalf of the will of the people, and during the more challenging eras like 1970s and previous, the LGBTQ community was not being treated the same as cisgender heterosexual people. The LGBTQ displayed a more modern liberal stance in their demands for change, equal social justice for all, and accountability of the government. Classic conservatism. Classic conservatives are the opposite of modern liberals. They are prevalent in history and are part of the reason why it was so difficult to instill reform in society for civil liberties. Their ideology around traditionalism, strong value of religion, authority, and order in society would not coincide with the progressiveness of the LGBTQ people who demanded a revolution for their rights, freedoms, and acceptance. And for the questions. Number 1. Do you think the rioting was justified, and would the gay pride movement have kicked off if the Stonewall riots didn't happen? Number 2. Do you believe the LGBTQ community has achieved their goals? Why or why not? Thank you. And here's the citation.